Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Everything Imaginable. I am your host, Gary Cacciolillo. And before we get started, I want to thank everybody for listening and also thank the contributors to my show, who are Candace Sanderson, author of The Reluctant Messenger, Joseph Simkovic, author of How to Kiss the Universe, Ms. Aida, author, psychic, spellcaster, root worker, and witch. And you can find her at misaida.com, missaida.com. And this episode is being sponsored by Ginger Glasser. And you can find her at tarotbyginger.com. And she's a tarot reader, evidential medium, and healer. And that's at tarotbyginger.com. And now, without further ado, our guest for today is Jim Willis. I'm happy to have him back. He's got a couple of new books coming out, one on American cult, and I believe the other one is with Cosmos is in the title. I can't find it on the internet. Thanks for coming on.
Cosmo and me.
So
good to see you again, Gary. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, fantastic. I always love having you on here. So tell us about the new books. Which one do you want to start with?
Well, let's start with American cults, I guess. It was a tough book to write, and people say, why a book on American cults right now? A writer has, a lot of things you want to write about when you're an author, all these different ideas, and you're trying to put them in order, and which one should I tackle next and everything else. But when a publisher calls you up and says, hey, I want to do a book on American cults, here's your advance money, you tend to put everything off the table and go with that. So that's where American cults came from. It wasn't necessarily by design. It wasn't a book that I was somehow trying to write, and it turned out to be a very difficult book to write because, boy, some of these cults have just been terrible to get down in the muck and the mire and see what some of these cult leaders are capable of and what some of these cults have done in terms of human history and everything else. It was tough, but on the other hand, I was probably the one to write it because so many cults have sprung off from Christianity in one way or another. They began as Christian groups. I'm thinking of people like Jim Jones and the People's Temple started off as the Full Gospel Church, and David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. David Koresh got his start with Seventh-day Adventism, and I was also alive and active in Christian ministry when everything started to go so wrong there for a while back in the 70s and 80s, when Jim Jones and Jim Baker and Jimmy Swaggart and all these Christian ministers named Jim kind of scared me a little. But I was active during all of that stuff. So I was familiar with it. And it turned out that during the year I was writing it, it was tough, but I had a lot of experience with it, and I learned a lot, and had a chance to talk to some very interesting people, people who had come out of some of these cults. And although it was difficult to write, I'm kind of glad I did. I learned a lot of stuff about not only cults, but about American history and how things operate. I learned a lot about American media. I learned a lot about social networking and things nowadays. And I learned a lot about how cults seem to be built into our DNA here in America. And it was an eye-opener because I also, during the course of it, learned a lot about me. There but for the grace of God go I, that kind of thing. So it was quite a time.
So what is the definition of a cult? Sometimes I look at it as maybe in some ways, everything is a cult. Like the government's a cult. All the religions are cults.
Sure.
Corporations are even cults.
Yeah. That was one of the hardest things. When I started writing a book about cults, my idea was just to talk about cults in general worldwide, and it was way too big a topic. So I talked to the publisher, and we had to limit it. So we limited it to American cults, since the bulk of my readership is probably here in America. But the first thing we had to do is come up with a definition of cult. What does it mean? Uh, so the definition that I came up with, I spend quite a bit of time talking about what I mean when I talk about cults.
Mhm.
And probably the common denominator of almost all, well, certainly all the cults that I looked at, was that they all have a recognizable a founder or a current leader, and it almost always is a he. There were a couple of women who led cults, and I talk about them too. But the cult leader is usually a very charismatic leader who's able to speak in a language that his followers seem to understand. He instinctively knows how to push the proper buttons, and when it comes to mobilizing people, and he'll speak to their needs, even if they themselves are not quite aware of what their needs are. Cult leaders are almost always brilliant manipulators, but that shouldn't be surprising because cult leaders are almost always narcissists, at least, and sometimes going into psychopaths or sociopaths. A narcissist really feels that he's at the center, not only of his own story, but of everybody else's story. Narcissists usually lack really any empathy. They're really in it for themselves. And they almost always display an unmistakable arrogance. They're normally in search of validation. They might feel a small sense of shame if they do wrong, but it's usually not because of what they did, but because they got caught.
Right.
But from narcissism, it's easy to step over the line into becoming a sociopath, and that's quite a different animal. A sociopath doesn't feel any shame. People are usually surprised to find that sociopaths can often pass lie detector tests because they don't feel they're lying. If they said it, it can't be lying. If they did it, it can't be wrong because they did it. If they do something, it's obviously justified because they're the ones doing it, and they'll go to almost any lengths to say it wasn't my fault. I mean, I'm doing what's right because I'm doing it. That kind of thing. So that's pretty much the definition of a cult, except that there is another side of it, because not only is there that charismatic leader, um, life is complicated, and for cult followers, people who join cults, it's usually because their life is definitely a complicated existence. Life is tough, and
Yeah.
and they don't understand. I mean, our lives are often out of our control. Just take cell phones for who really knows how a cell phone works. I mean, nobody does. We can push the buttons, but you're telling me a signal pops off to a tower someplace, which sends a signal into space to a satellite, which sends it down to a server, and somebody's able to hear a ring on their cell phone and pick it up right. That Who understands that stuff really, except for a very complicated few people.
Mhm.
And life gets out of control. So people are busy and complicated, and it feels like there's a need, something is missing in their lives, and it's too hard to figure out, and all of a sudden comes this cult leader who says, I got the answer. Here it is right here. And by the time a person joins a cult, if there's any following at all, they're people who seem to have it all together. They understand, and so they're there to welcome the new person in and just say, here is your answer. Life is simple. You can put it on a bumper sticker. That easy. Don't bother figuring out. We'll just tell you. And there is that need. And I kind of thought when I started off this project that I was going to discover the cults are on their way out, because I was of the idea that, well, people think nowadays, there's so much more information at their fingertips and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Instead, it's just exactly the opposite, because people are sitting a lot of time at home alone. They're isolated. Even at work, a lot of them are just sitting at a computer, or standing on an assembly line, or driving a truck, or doing something where they're all alone with their thoughts, and they're seeing this complicated world. Boy, it's a big temptation just to say, yeah, here's this guy who's got it together. I'm just going to go with him. He sounds like he knows what he's talking about. And bingo, you've got a cult. I understand that last count, there's something like 5,000 active cults in America right now.
Wow.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
Hmm. So are all cults bad?
No, no. And as a matter of fact, a lot of cults started out one way and became recognized, like you said before about religion. Christian theologians, even today, uh, talk about early Christianity as being a Jesus cult
Hmm.
embedded in Judaism 2,000 years ago. And it just gradually over the time became recognized. And 300 years after the death of Jesus, when Constantine recognized Christianity as a state religion, boom, there it was. Sometimes theologians have a saying that says, cult plus time equals religion. Um,
Hmm.
and and sometimes cults can even start out questionable, but then they get dignified over the age, over the years. A lot of early religions were considered cults. When Joseph Smith had his visions, and the Mormon Church began, the Latter-day Saints, they were considered a cult, and they were driven from the area, and they made their way eventually all the way to Salt Lake City. He never made it, but Brigham Young did. And what was at the beginning a cult with a
Hmm.
lot of questionable practices like polygamy and other things like that eventually became an established religion. Um, you look at American history. I always get a kick out of this because we read the history books and we're told that the early Puritans, when they came to New England, were far-seeing visionaries, who were going to build a city on a shining city on a hill and all that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
But people don't remember that they were cults. They were driven out of their home. They were considered a cult. They were called separatists.
Hmm.
And when they came here, yeah, sure, they built some great cities. I mean, Boston and some other places like that. But then what happened as soon as they started getting uh, organized and as soon as they started getting recognized? Well, they started demonstrating perfect cult-like behavior. They basically said, we got the right way, our way or the highway. And they began to persecute. If you were a Quaker, rode them out of town on a rail. If you were a Shaker, any kind of thing that didn't agree. If you were a single woman living alone who liked to take a walk in the woods or gather herbs, you were a witch. And they had the Salem witch trials. And
Hmm.
one of the great cult leaders of that time was a kind of a spiritual ancestor of mine, I guess, because Cotton Mather was a preacher in New England Congregationalism, and that was a
Hmm.
denomination that I was with for 40 years. And he went to the Salem witch trials and heard the pronouncements and listened to it and never opened his mouth. That's classic cultic behavior right there. And yet the years went on, and eventually time worked its magic, and New England Congregationalism began, it split off like cults are always splitting off.
Hmm.
Unitarians split off from Trinitarians. And eventually, Congregationalists joined and became different denominations like the Conservative Christian Congregationalists, or the United Church of Christ was partly based on the New England Congregationalism, and they became respectable. So yeah, cults aren't always cults, and that's why I worry a little bit when people say, "Is this a cult or is that a cult?" I hate to label things cults, although I had to in the book because there's no other way to get around it.
Hmm.
I hate to label things cults, and so I like to talk about cultic methodology. Anytime anybody uses the methods of a cult, they're a cult, as far as we can see.
Yeah, I remember watching a special on Charles Manson,
Yeah,
and like one of his things though that he did was there was some kind of I forget which book it was, but I think it was like on how to do something with people
yeah,
that influence. It was like this self-help sort of metaphysical type book, and
yeah,
he used that like it was like early NLP, I guess,
yeah,
and he
yeah.
used that to build his following.
there's a classic example. Charles Manson was a classic cult leader, and then the group that formed around him, the Manson family, was that was a classic cult that we might never have heard about it if they hadn't gone over the top and started doing all kinds of things like, kidnapping and housebreaking and even possibly murder and that kind of thing. But it had all the examples of a cult. And cults use certain methods that frankly make me feel very uncomfortable because I used those same methods when I was a pastor of a church. Take a classic example of let's say an economic cult. There's a lot of them around that are not necessarily doing anything bad, but they're using cultic methods. For instance, person is having trouble paying the bills and they don't know, where am I going to get the money to pay my mortgage or buy groceries or something like that. And they feel like they're just worthless in this capitalist, ideas that we have about the more wealthy you are, the better you are, and all that kind of stuff. And so a friend comes and he says, you got to join this group. You got to come to this group. You don't have to join anything. Just come with me this weekend. We're having a big rally, a big meeting at a downtown hotel. And you'll hear all kinds of inspirational stuff. So you go there, you get out of your car at the parking lot, you're feeling worthless, you're feeling like you're all alone, you're feeling like everybody's doing, everybody's got their A sides up on Facebook and nobody has the B sides, and all that kind of thing. So you're thinking, I'm the only one, man, I can't make it go. You get out of the car and all of a sudden there's an energy in the air and people are shaking your hand and they're greeting you, come on in. And you go inside and there's music pumping and there's this big ballroom is full of people who are happy and laughing and smiling and singing and dancing. And then the testimonies start, where a guy comes up and says, I was down to my last $1.50, man, and I got this starter kit and I started selling product and now I'm driving around in a pink Cadillac, that kind of thing. I'm a success. And so you say, this is it. These are my kind of people. Here's the answer. And so you get there, you buy their starter kit and you go home and you're full of great intentions and you sell some product maybe to some family members or some friends, and that's it. Nothing happens. And you get down in the dumps again. So your friends, your new friends call you up and they say, well, come on to this next level meeting we're having. It's the next step up. And it costs a little more money, but come on, and so you go. And all these people are well-meaning, they're not trying to rook you or anything like that. They really care for you. But so you go in and it keeps building. And every time you leave one of these meetings, you're pumped, you're jazzed up, you're all set to go. And then it starts to fade again. And so they start saying, well, maybe you're surrounding yourself with people who are negative, your family and your old friends. They're negative. They're drawing you down. Why don't you get away from them, pull away from them, stick more with us? And that's how a cult operates. And it's classic cultic methodology. And my problem with it is that's the same thing we do in churches. For 40 years, I would tell the people in my church, man, when someone drives into our parking lot, shake their hand, bring them into the church, show them around, make them feel comfortable, take them to the coffee hour. And the music is going and it's upbeat. And then the testimonies start, I did this, and God did this for me. And then the talented talker, me, stands up and gives a great motivational speech about get your life together and all this kind of stuff. And then we pass the collection plate, of course. And then people start to tell us that, well, my family and friends think I'm just a holy roller or something like that. What do I do? Well, and some people, well-meaning people in the church say, well, maybe they're negative. Maybe. There it is. It's the same methodology. I look back right now, I'm ashamed of myself, but I don't know what else to do. I don't think I ever stepped over the line and became a narcissistic cult leader, but boy, I sure could have come close if I'd wanted to. The temptation was always there. And it's a humbling thing to realize how close this hits every single one of us.
That is spooky. It's definitely spooky.
Yeah, it really is.
In podcasting, there's like life coaching. Life coaches are almost like a cultish thing, like where you're talking about that economic thing, like oh yeah, we'll make you feel better, do this, do that, pay them,
Mhm.
some the first time is they get something minor like $30.
Yeah,
Then
yeah,
then they hit you up for $100 and like $300,
yeah,
in the end, like the only advice they're giving you is
yeah.
to start a podcast, to become a life coach yourself, and start collecting other people's
Yeah.
money.
It that too hits me right between the eyes because a couple of years ago, as a matter of fact, I think we talked about this one time in a previous conversation. I had just published a trilogy, a series of 3 books on
Mhm.
ego, and one of them was one of the books. Well, the first book was about Merlin the magician, and the second one was about the Robin Hood, and the third was Snow White. And I talked about the rise of ego in today's culture through the study of these 3 stories. But in Snow White, especially, there's a um, great scene in Snow White that everybody is familiar with, where the wicked queen, who's trying to win over the innocent Snow White and get her into the cult of the queen, that kind of thing, looks in her mirror every morning. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? And the mirror said, "Yeah, you are." And that makes the queen, that feeds her ego. That's really great. And I was thinking about this story after I came out here to the woods to get away from everything, get away from life. And I started writing books, and of course, and I started having a website. I started having a YouTube page and a Facebook page. And I found myself one morning turning on the computer, couldn't wait to see how many new people looked at my YouTube page, the new video we just put up or something like that. And if there was a good number, I was feeling great. And if it was only a few, I'd say, "Oh, what did I do wrong?" Everything else. And I was just like the wicked queen. I was measuring my self-worth by how many people were tuning in. And I was saying, like, computer on the desk, who's the best of all the rest or something like that, and the computer would say, give me my feedback. Oh, it's a terrible trap, isn't it, that we can get into, that all these cultic methods.
Yeah, I do that too. I'll look at my podcast numbers. Oh, what's wrong here?
Isn't it terrible? Oh,
Yeah.
we are interesting creatures. That's for sure.
So, suicide cults. Why do people start those? Like, guys like Jim Jones and what
Yeah.
was that guy, Seventh Gate one,
Yeah,
whatever that
heaven's
one was,
heaven's
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 Gate.
gate, Appleweight. Yeah, yeah.
So like, what's the point of having followers just to kill yourself in the end anyway?
Yeah, in every one of those, the people who leading the cult, whether it was Jim Jones down in Guyana, or whether it was Appleweight up here in with the Heaven's Gate cult, they all began to think of themselves not only as narcissists and sociopaths, but they began to think of themselves as the chosen ones. And they kept it right up until the end. Their cult leaders actually began to think that these people were God, or um, higher aliens from outer space, or something like that, people who were going to save us. And it just grew and grew, and the cult began to elevate these people higher and higher, until pretty soon the people began to believe, I am God, or I am God's chosen one, or something. And eventually, when there's no place else to go, and when it all falls apart, there's only one thing left to do. Jesus went willingly to the cross, they tell their people, and he died and now we have to do the same thing. If we die, David Koresh was the same people with the Branch Davidians down in Waco. We are the chosen ones, and it's surrounded the government, or the deep state, or the FBI, or the evil people have surrounded us, and there's no way out. So if we take our own lives, we will die to this earth and wake up in heaven. It's the idea of death and resurrection. Powerful, powerful symbol. And when people are willing to go to their death for you, then right away there's a cult like following.
Hmm.
Yes. And I think it comes from people who try to find their self-worth, or their meaning, or their purpose through either somebody else or something else. It's always got to come from outside. If Jesus comes back, he will save us. If the aliens come and pick us up from this earth before the earth destroys itself, we will be saved. People always have the idea that somehow our salvation is going to come from outside, from somewhere else. And our worth and our purpose is going to be taken over for us, something from outside. And they just don't realize, none of us, it's hard to sometimes realize that if we're going to find our own worth and our own purpose, it's got to come from within, not from without. And that's what makes cult leaders so deadly sometimes. Yeah.
Is it simply that people don't want to take responsibility for their own lives?
Yeah.
And so they just turn it over to somebody else.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. Jim Jones was great at this. There were a lot of, when Jim Jones was at his height here in the United States, I mean, he was at one point a Methodist preacher, and then he went with the Assemblies of God. And the Assemblies of God denomination had this movement within them called the Latter-day Rain movement. And Jim Jones got so involved in that, and that he was eventually disbarred by the Assemblies of God and by the Methodist Church. And he started basically his own movement. And when eventually he went to people started complaining because their mothers and fathers and everything else were joining this cult. But in order to join this cult, these older people who felt vulnerable and didn't know where to turn, the world was changing so fast in the 70s and 80s, and they couldn't keep up. And so he just said, I'll tell you what, sell your house, give me all the money, just, or sign your house over to us and we'll sell it. Give me everything and I'll take care of you for the rest of your life. And boy, that was a pretty powerful incentive. So these people said, okay, I can't figure out life. Pastor Jones, you do it. Sold everything, gave it to him, and said, I just have to trust you for the rest of my life now. And look where it led him. Eventually, because the IRS was after him because of the way he was handling funds and because of complaints. And eventually he moved down to Guyana, where he'd be away out of the United States. But even then, people began to complain to their representatives, their political representatives at home. And Reverend Leo Ryan went down there to Guyana to check out the situation on behalf of his constituents who still were there. And what he saw was just appalling. And Jim Jones and the leadership of the People's Temple Full Gospel Church, they knew that the jig was up. And Reverend Ryan was met on the tarmac with a hail of bullets. And boy, when you kill a congressman and all of his entourage, you know it's over. And so that night, 913 people drank the Kool-Aid. The cyanide, wasn't really Kool-Aid, but that's become the expression, the Kool-Aid. And 304 of them were children. Their parents fed it to their kids. And then they took it after the kids died. And when everybody was dead, Jim Jones shot himself in the head. And that was it. 913 people dead there. It was just unbelievable. You think, how could that happen? But it did. It did.
Yeah, it's amazing how it just spirals out of control like that.
Yeah. And like anything else, once you got invested in something, whether it's investing a certain amount of money or whether you're investing a lot of time or a lot of your commitment, you figure, well, I got so much invested, I can't get out. It's like playing poker. I've lost so much money. I better bet more to try to get it back, that kind of thing. And it never works. Never works. And it's always step by step by step by step, slowly. So we don't realize it's happening until it's too late.
Is there anything that people can do to avoid or help people that are involved with these cults?
Oh, I wish I had an easy answer for that one. But no, I don't. You can confront people, and that was when cults were really big back in the 70s and early 80s. There were deprogrammers who made a living of being hired to kidnap people out of cults. but it didn't work, really,
Mhm.
hardly at all. The trouble is that people went to a cult because they had a specific need. They may not have been able to identify it, whether it was loneliness or acceptance or validation or what. They may not have been able to identify it, but the cult supplied that need. And you can pull somebody out of a cult, forcefully, but it won't do any good unless you replace it by meeting the need of that person. And unfortunately, that person themselves are usually the only one who can really supply that need. So when people say, I've got a family member, or I've got a friend who's involved in a cult, or I've had a couple of emails since the book came out, or um, calls from people who are saying, I'm involved in something. I think it's a cult. And should I get out? How can I do it? If you have a family member or a friend who's involved in something like that, the best advice I can do is all you can do is love them to death. You just have to be there for them. When they get out of that cult, they're going to have to supply that need has got to be supplied.
Mm.
And it's really almost impossible for you to supply it. All you can do is offer them a secure environment, a safe environment, so they can meet that need themselves and help them to understand that they need to meet that need. But it's really, really, really difficult. Even people who try to get out of organizations that are not cults. I'm amazed at how many Christians say, I'm not happy in the church anymore, but I can't seem to get out. I can't, because I'm just afraid. What if they were right? Kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. Deepak Chopra was once very involved in the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi and his transcendental meditation (TM) movement, and so were the Beatles, for that
Mm-hmm.
matter. He was either John or George, I think, who said, "Yeah, we were wrong there," but they got very, very much involved with it. But Deepak Chopra got out of it because, although he was very big into meditation and transcendental meditation, he recognized the cult-like following that was gathering around this leader, the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi.
Mm-hmm.
And so he got out. He said, I wasn't comfortable with it. And that took a tremendous amount of courage. And it's hard. It's hard for people to do that. It really is.
Mm. So I'm going to sort of segue down to your other book, but from this in
Ah,
an interesting way, though. So I'm thinking, like we're talking about this, and your other book is Me and the Cosmos and Me,
yeah, Cosmo and me.
and I'm thinking like,
Yeah,
obviously as about some of the things that we talk about usually is like more like New Age spiritualism, quantum type of stuff,
yeah.
shamanic type of experience, out of body
Well,
experience. Does that some of the stuff that you and I are into
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
fall into the cult category?
yeah. Cosmo and me. The subtitle gives it all away. The subtitle is um, a, a seeker's journey from religion to spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
And I call it Cosmo and Me. It's kind of an autobiography. It's a biography of a seeker who, during the last 7 decades, I'm 77 now, so um, I've known more than 7 decades, and it occurred to me that I needed to have a palate cleanser after I wrote American Cults. I wanted to do something positive, and I began to look at my own life's journey and realizing that uh, it doesn't come out to every 10 years, but basically, you can divide the last 7 decades of American history into 7 different decades. Each of those 10-year periods, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, they were different. And for a spiritual seeker, someone who's always looking for spirituality in their life rather than just a simple religious construct, each decade offered a different set of challenges. And that's what Cosmo and Me is all about. I say Cosmo and Me because I hate to use the word God and me, because everybody has a different version of God,
Yeah, it's a
different
tough
meaning
word
for
that.
God. And they might not, when I say the word God, they might think I'm saying what they mean by it, but I'm not
Mm-hmm.
saying so I just started calling God Cosmo. And
Right.
and it's interesting. I began to look back and see those different decades and realize each one of them offered a specific set of challenges to somebody who was seeking a spiritual life. For instance, the 50s. I like to, a person who was born as I was, a white middle class, maybe even upper middle class guy out in suburbia. Um, that was a pretty leave it to Beaver type existence, I mean, Donna Reed and Leave It to Beaver and all that. Yeah, I like to think of it as a pond. On the surface, everything was nice and smooth, a little duck floating around on the pond and lilies growing, and everything seemed to be smooth. Once in a while, a storm would blow across, but it would calm down everything else. But if you look below the surface, man, there was all kinds of stuff going on. Little fish were getting eaten by big fish, and the muck and the mire that had settled down there. And that was the 50s. To a kid growing up in suburban Detroit back then, never had to worry about money and going to a typical suburban school and all that kind of stuff. Everything was pretty placid on the surface. Everybody was going to church. That was when churches started building what they called fellowship halls, and there were dinners. And a spiritual seeker back then, man, all you had to do was go to church, say the right things, say the platitudes, and that was it. You never wanted to get too personal. God, you just call God the man upstairs, or you never prayed, you hit your knees, and all that kind of stuff. Keep separate from it, that kind of thing. But boy, all that stuff that was festering underneath, man, did that come bubbling up in the 60s. And as a child of the 60s, I was a little older. I was a teenager and going to high school and then college all in the 60s. And that's when, peace and love and cults all over the place. And the beatniks of the 50s turned into the hippies of the 60s and all this kind of stuff. And there were riots in the streets and people got politically involved. And Archie Bunker, in his living room, there was him and Meathead, showed the two sides of it and everything else. And all that stuff that had been festering in the 50s came bubbling to the top in the 60s. And it was a tough time. So it took a different kind of spiritual seekers in the 60s. They began to look toward, that was where the whole idea of New Age came about, and the Back to the Land movement and communes and all of that stuff. It was a different, if you were going to try to find your way in the 60s, you started experimenting with different psychedelics, and LSD was big, tune in, turn on, drop out, and everything else. A different kind of seeking for spirituality. And then came the 70s, and oh man, everything changed. All the hippies came off the commune and started becoming bankers, and financial advisors and startups and everything else. And all of a sudden, economics took over in the 70s. If you wanted to really find yourself in the 70s, you had to dig down through all the commercialism, and elders were no longer listened to in the 70s because they didn't understand what was happening. I mean, how could an elder understand the internet? Right. Basically all this kind of stuff. And man, when that came to a bust in the 80s, when the bottom fell out, people were just kind of wandering around, and that was a different decade, seeking in a different way. And now, quite frankly, this decade didn't turn out anything at all like I thought. I mean, this is a huge political upheaval where we've got political cults on both the right and the left, and people not paying any attention to each other, people hating each other. I mean, and people coming up with these platitudes. I come by a flag that someone has flying out in front of their house and in my town that says, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, that kind of thing, and just rainbows belong to God, and there's no give and take. There's no talking. And it's so different. I remember the days when I was up in New England, and Tip O'Neill was the Speaker of the House, radical,
Hmm.
you know, liberal, and tremendous amount of power in Washington. And then out of California comes Ronald Reagan, who was politically against everything that Tip O'Neill stood for. He was a arch conservative. And those two could go at each other and not have anything in common politically at all. But at the end of the day, they could sit down, put their feet up, drink a couple of beers, tell each other Irish stories, you know, and that kind of thing. They respected each other as people, as human beings, even though they disagreed politically. That day is gone now. We're in the days now of what I like to call the political cults. And I'm not talking about the right or the left, I'm talking about both the right and the left. There's political progressive cults and there's arch conservative cults. And boy, the two never meet. And you have a different kind of cult now
Hmm.
that frankly scares the living daylights out of me. And that's the cult of the internet. Whereas people are connected and that can be a wonderful thing. I mean, you know, you're doing important work because you get people on with differing ideas and you're giving people something to think about and all this kind of stuff, and it can bring people together. But there are a lot of internet groups out there, as you well known, where people wouldn't have even known that other people existed who thought the way they did, and now they meet on the dark web. And they form these little cults where there's a small group in Maine and a small group in Florida and a small group in the Midwest and a
Hmm.
small group in California. All of a sudden, they realize, hey, we're pretty big, and they realized how much verve they had when they could just on the internet alone get people of like minds who would never even known about other groups like them to march on Washington on January 6th, you know, that kind of
Right.
thing. And it was all the internet. So everything in this life comes with heads and tails, a two-sided coin, good and bad. And the cult of the internet is a very real thing nowadays. And it scares me because we're beginning to see it right now, a tremendous change. I don't know what, for instance, is going to happen. There are groups that can actually hack into the political systems in other countries, and
Hmm.
there's I don't know what AI is going to bring, by artificial intelligence. You talk about a weird thing there. Everybody's saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." Well, I do worry about it because
Hmm.
it can have some great meetings, you know, and quantum computing. It can be a wonderful thing, but man, let's not lose the negatives. Um, I think we're at the same point now that we were back in the early 40s with nuclear energy.
Hmm.
Einstein, of course, coming up, you know, with the what eventually became the nuclear weapon we have today, and it can do a tremendous amount of good in terms of powering people and all this kind of stuff. But what's going to happen when that wall of water that is coming out in Ukraine right now, coming downstream after the dam was broken
Right.
yesterday? And what's going to happen when that hits that nuclear power plant? We don't know. Can we get it off in time? We don't know. 3 Mile Island, that was close. Chernobyl, that was close.
Hmm.
We just don't know what can happen. And um, so all of those things, they have the basis for doing a tremendous amount of good, but wow, they can do a tremendous amount of evil too.
Do you think there's a fine line, or is there a line even between like terrorism and cults?
Oh, yeah. I'm not. I hadn't thought about it in those terms, but I'm not even sure there is a line because terrorism certainly uses cultic methodology. You come in,
Hmm.
you brainwash your people, you break them down, you build them up in your own image, and you create people who are committed to a cause and will give their life for it. You know, suicide bombers, things like that. And on the other hand, a lot of people have wonderful military careers, and they'll tell you that's exactly what boot camp is supposed to do. You know, that's supposed to take a person, break him down,
Right.
and build them back up again in a military mindset. And as a result, we have things, you know, PTSD is now bigger than it ever was. I remember Vietnam, when some of my friends went off to Vietnam, and they've come back totally different people from what they saw and what they did over there. And I've talked to some of them now years later, and they said, I don't know how I could have done that. I don't, right now, they said, I can't consider myself even possible that I could go into a native village and just start shooting people, women and children and men, all because I just assumed they were all the enemy. He said, now I couldn't do it. But back then it seemed perfectly normal. We were ordered, we did it. It was all there was to it. That's all cult-like behavior. And so yeah, between that cults and terrorism, is there a line? I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, it's all mind control.
Yeah.
I think that definitely all falls under that category or that umbrella of mind control.
Yeah.
It's like it's it all depends on what they're controlling. Are you controlling their spiritual beliefs? Are you controlling their political beliefs? Are you controlling their economic beliefs?
Yeah. 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 Psychologists have to worry about that all the time. When somebody comes in, they said, what do you think? And it's almost a cliche, but a psychologist, if the psychologist starts saying, well, this is what I think you should do, that's almost like mind control or cultic behavior. So psychologists are trained to say, well, what do you think you should do? The answer has got to come from you. Mind control is probably the key factor of any cult. And I've seen that happen. In the 50s, there was a certain kind of mind control that said, we're building these great, like most of the 50s, I was in Detroit. And, the Ford or Chrysler or GM would say, we're building these cars and they're going to revolutionize your life. You got to have one. And so they lobbied very hard to get Eisenhower to put in the interstate system. And it was called, the greatest infrastructure project ever done. Everybody had jobs and money was flowing. But on the other hand, there were people who were very cynically using the interstate. They started building these big malls out of town. The first mall in the country was built up in Northland outside of Detroit. I tell the story in my book how I actually, as a kid, pounded a few nails up there. and it was on the surface, everybody was saying, oh, this is wonderful. We've got roads now connecting everywhere in the United States. And Eisenhower did that. And that's great because that's going to make it safer for us to transport goods and cross country and everything else. And everybody's saying, oh, we got great cars. You can get out and afford them, And the people who are building the malls are saying, come on out to the mall. You got the car, you got the roads, everything else. And everybody was saying, oh, this is terrific. They're doing all this for us. Well, no, it was cynical mind control on the part of the government, on the part of big business, on the part of the marketing people, advertising people. That came to fruition in the 50s. See the USA and your Chevrolet, and that was the siren call, and everybody ran and did it and everything else. And it was followed by a different kind of mind control than the 60s. And probably that was where psychedelics got so big. They're controlling your mind. Pop an LSD pill or take some mushrooms or something like that. Change your mind. They're trying to control your mind. Tune in, turn on, drop out. They're controlling your mind. But in the course of that, it was a different kind of mind control was substituted. Then, of course, when we hit the 80s and everything else, and everybody, or the 90s, and everybody was talking about control. The idea is, if you're wealthy, then you're a success. And now it's political. The political parties are trying to control your mind, both right and left. They never tell you quite all the truth. They never show themselves warts and all. None of them do. And it's a different kind of mind control, but it is mind control. And it's not just in politics. I was so afraid when I look back of what happened in academia, for instance. When I was a college professor, I was very much aware how easy it was to, I saw professors do it. They would write the textbook that was used in their classroom. Me too. I wrote the religion book, And then all of a sudden, some new stuff comes along that seems to contradict it. And, well, mind control. I don't want the students finding out about this stuff because, I mean, all that's going to do is just make it harder for me. I got to answer these questions. It's in my textbook, So you sweep the stuff under the rug. Hope that nobody hears about it. It happens in academia, and cruel things can happen. In different science fields. I mean, here scientists are supposed to open to the truth and always looking for new stuff, right? But they do terrible things. I mean, Hugh Everett, for instance, came up back in the 50s, 56, I think it was. And Hugh Everett came up with the idea of the multiverse.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody said, oh, you're crazy. And they wouldn't have anything to do with him. He couldn't get a job. He couldn't teach. If he wrote books, nobody would publish it. They forced him out of physics. Tremendous theoretical physicist, forced him out of the field totally. He had to get a job working in the government, which maybe turned out for the best because he was the one who came up with the idea of mutually assured destruction, which might have got us through the Cold War. I don't know. But anyway, he died thinking he was a failure, thinking he was a total failure, because they not only attacked his facts, they attacked his character. And they, the cult of science, blackballed him and said, "You're not part of us." Now his ideas are accepted everywhere. Mm-hmm. Very common. I just saw a news report. What's his Michio Kuko? Kuko. I just heard him say something that was so refreshing, because some of this new stuff from the James Webb Space Telescope is just upending the whole idea, right, of the Big Bang and everything else. And I heard him actually say, "We may have to rewrite the textbooks." What a courageous thing to say. But very few scientists will do that. The Clovis first archaeologists in this country, mm-hmm, who thought that the Clovis people were the first people in America 12,000, 16,000 years ago at the most. They held sway for 100 years. If you weren't in their cult, you couldn't get a job, you couldn't teach, you couldn't get any money to do archaeology. 100 years they ran the cult of archaeology, mm-hmm, their particular brand of it, and now that's starting to break up. So
and now Newtonian physics too is starting to. It's just taken 80 years for quantum physics to.
That's right.
Boom. Because people don't want to let go of Newtonian.
Yeah, even Einstein didn't want to do it. Spooky action, mm-hmm, at a distance. Or
he talked about it, he acknowledged it, but he didn't want to.
Yeah, it took him a long time to do it. You're absolutely right. Oh yeah, the cults or cult-like methodology rather is everywhere. Boy, we have to be so careful of it. And that's why I love to write Cosmo and Me, because I could inject some humor. Hard to put humor into American cults. I did have one chapter that I wrote about I forgot the guy's name now, who came up with the birds aren't real cult. Mm-hmm. And he was hysterical. He was doing it as a complete put down. Mm-hmm. And he came up and stayed in character for years. And so many people who knew what he was doing, they stayed in character. The idea that he came up with this idea that birds aren't real; they're all government drones, and real birds. And you can tell it for sure, because he had absolute proof. Because when you see birds on a power line, resting on the power line, they're recharging their batteries and stuff like that. And I mean, so I did put that chapter in because I thought that was absolutely hysterical, a brilliant idea of a put on for cults. But when you stop to think about it, I look back on my own life in Cosmo and Me, and see how I made the journey from religion to spirituality, and how hard it was to do that. The pressures were immense. I finally had to, when I retired, I finally had to come out here and live in the woods just to get away from that all and find out, consult the essential me, that Thoreau talked about when he went out to the woods at Walden Pond. And it's a constant trouble with us.
Maybe people just avoided each other.
Yeah. There's there's like I say, everything comes. We live in a world of dualism. Everything comes with a good and a bad,
Hmm.
and that's the whole secret. But the secret to knowing where the line is, I think, is spiritual growth. There are some uh, religious leaders who didn't know where the line was, and they crossed it. And there are a lot of religious leaders who could have crossed it, but did realize there was a line there, so they didn't. And a lot of it has to do with fame and money and validation and all that kind of stuff. It's easy to take the easy way out. Um, the old biblical writers were so right with that great metaphor. Narrow is the way to go heaven, and broad is the path to hell. And the choice is ever before us,
Would you
always, everywhere.
consider Joel Osteen like a cult leader? Someone like
Well, he
him?
he certainly uses some cultic methodologies, like a lot of big time preachers do. And this whole idea of the prosperity gospel, God will bless you if you, um, if do your, do your duty as we see it, and
Yeah,
then
if you, as long
give
as
us,
you're doing your tithing,
give us your
right?
money, your tithes and offerings, send them here, and God will bless you for it. And just to prove it, Joel Osteen lives in a mansion and drives around in some very expensive cars. Jim Baker did it with the PTL club, um, and he spent time in prison because of it. When he built that great Christian amusement park down in
Hmm.
Florida, along with his big condominiums, and you could have a timeshare there, but he way oversold it, and the funds were used wrong. I mean, he had so much funds that he actually was the first one to put up a Christian satellite that would broadcast just Christian broadcasting. That was the announcement he made on the day it went up in Florida. I'll never forget it. The PTL Club swears from now day in, we promise that we will broadcast Christian broadcasting from now till the return of Jesus Christ. How much money does it take to put a satellite up there? And people gave it and gave and gave and gave. And he wound up in prison for it. He was in prison for 45 years, but he got out after only a few. And he's doing it again now, ever since 2003. He's up north of me, and he's still, selling the handkerchiefs that he has personally blessed that will make you, you know, more of a success and all this kind of thing.
Mm.
Oh,
But one of the things, like, I think that some of the stuff that you and I talk about, normally too, when we get into, like, spiritual beliefs that we have, you know, the individual has control. Like the power of prayer in
mhm.
a lot of ways is more the power of our own ability to manifest through our own consciousness is what
Yeah,
it is, and our
yeah,
own connection with the universe, that we're a part of the universe and the universe is us.
yeah, yeah. That's it. Yeah, you just put your finger on it when you said the universe is us. That's really that's really the key. The idea. I love the Hindu concept of Brahman and Atman. You can't describe Brahman. You can't use words. There are no
Right.
words fit to describe Brahman. And if you try to put Brahman in a verbal box, you've missed it. But Atman is that inner expression, the soul, for lack of a better word, the spirit that is within each one of us. And the great concept 6,000 years ago, the Hindu rishis saw this, that thou art that. Brahman and Atman are one. The universe is not out there, it's in here with us. God is not out there, God is in here within us. We are all expressions of that unity, that source, cosmo, I call it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the real spiritual journey. Joseph Campbell was so good at this. He said, you want to go on a quest, don't go out there, go in here. That's where you're going to find it. So
Yeah, we're intimately connected, obviously, with the universe, and we're part
yeah,
of it.
yeah. I love the whole idea of biocentrism, the idea that the universe doesn't really take shape. Anything we're looking at, it doesn't take shape out there. It takes place in our minds. It
Yeah,
doesn't
we
even,
created it.
it doesn't, yeah, we created ourselves. It doesn't come into existence until we have it in our minds. And
Hmm.
that's, of course, quantum physics. That's what quantum physics said. There has to be an observer in order to bring about an effect. It's quantum foam until you look at it. And
Hmm.
if you look at it, you expect to find a wave, you're going to find a wave. And if you look at it and expect to find a particle, you're going to find a particle. And you are the thing, which really says something about consciousness. The whole idea of the Big Bang. um, who was the observer at the beginning? How could it have possibly happened according to quantum physics, unless there was a consciousness that brought it out to bear? And then when you start to think that we are simply the manifestation of that same consciousness, wow, that
Yeah, it's
that puts it right
powerful.
that puts it
Yeah,
right inside where it
yeah.
belongs, doesn't
It,
it?
it's
Yeah.
both empowering and humbling at the same
Yeah,
time, I
you're
think.
right. You've hit it right on the button. Yeah. Yeah.
You know.
I on my website, I love that quote that says the universe is not only bigger than we imagine, or stranger than we imagine, it's stranger than we can imagine. And that universe is all within us. I'm writing a book now on near-death experiences, and I'm amazed at the number of people who have that experience after they've died, of holding the cosmos in their hand and realizing that it's all within them, and it always
Mhm.
was. Wow. Comforting and humbling. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
Empowering and comforting. Yeah.
yeah, because you realize the universe is what you're going to focus your attention on.
Yeah.
So, from a personal point of view,
Yeah.
but at the same time, it's like I'm just like this small part of this massive
Yeah.
experience, whatever
Yeah.
this is.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what it is even.
I love Einstein when he first heard that and said, "You mean the moon doesn't exist if I'm not looking at it?" And the quantum physics said, "Yeah, yeah, Al, you're right. The moon only exists in your mind. That's right. That's where it really exists."
Yeah.
So,
It's been a pleasure having you on as always.
oh, thank you, Gary. It's always good to talk. I love where our discussions kind of grow as we go.
Yeah, yeah, it's always good. And before we wrap it up, though, where's the best place for everybody to find you?
uh,
And when are the books coming out?
well, I'll tell you, best way is just go to jimwillis.net, and that's my website. And on the front page, the homepage of that website, you'll find both books, The American Cults and Cosmo and Me. And all you got to do is click on either one, and it'll take you either to Amazon or Barnes and Noble or Target,
Mhm.
or um, in some cases, it might take you to Visible Link, which published American Cults, or take you to a brand new publishing company, which I'm really excited about. Mine was the first book they published, called Uncle Bear Publishing. And you can go to their website too. But just go to jimwillis.net, and all the rest of my books are there too. You just click on the cover and under books, and it also lists my YouTube page and my Facebook page and all the rest of that stuff.
Awesome. Well, I'll put a link to that in the notes of this episode so my listeners
Wonderful.
can find you, contact you, and buy your books.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I really like to say this on my webpage. There is a contact page, and all you have to do is click on that. And I still am to the point where I try to answer every email. I'd love to hear, because you and I can see each other as we talk to
Hmm.
each other long distance, but we have no idea who's out there. So I love it when people contact me and say, "I heard you and I agree with this, or I disagree with that." It's just great to keep the dialogue going.
Yeah, I like it too. It helps me, gives me feedback on what people like, what people don't like.
Sure.
It's the only contact we really have with our audience. It's email.
Really good. Really good.
All right. Well, this is fun, and I'll do it again.
We will. Thank you, Gary. Appreciate it.
Me too. And just hang on for a moment. I'm just going to play the outro.
Okay.